activated halfway! Stop them!
Alright guys, what's going on? Today I want to talk about kind of the general landscape of what gaming is going to be in the next couple of years. With this new Indiana Jones game coming out and requiring ray tracing, a lot of people have been up in arms because it's a required technology. It's not something that is optional. They are using ray tracing for the material detection. They are using ray tracing for the entire lighting engine, so therefore they don't have to put as many lights everywhere. Development costs on big games, a lot of the time, will benefit greatly from all of the hardware that's, one, already out there, because keep in mind, the 20 series GPUs have been on the market since 2018. The PlayStation and the Xbox both have hardware ray tracing support, and these consoles are targeting exactly that. They have hardware ray tracing, 8 cores, decent GPU, and even though these don't have, this APU doesn't have a massive GPU behind it, it's still able to do ray tracing. It's still able to do high frame rate and high resolution. The market has been shifting towards these cards and this device and this technology for years now. And at this point, ray tracing is pretty common. The consumer nowadays expects to have more bells and whistles turned on in all of their games, whether it be they want a higher frame rate as well as higher fidelity. They want to play the game and have it look pretty at the same time, not just choose between it looking good or it running good. The hardware's there, it already does it, and developers are optimizing for specifically that hardware. I understand that you might feel left behind because all of a sudden your 1080 Ti isn't the king that it used to be. And I get that. I have plenty more life out of that card. It's something that a lot of people are rightly upset with. But as technology moves on, you gotta realize that things are going to change. Things are going to get more intensive. You're going to have higher hardware requirements all the time. That's just how it goes. That's how it's always worked. You're not going to have the golden age of hardware where it will run everything forever. That's just not how things go. Unfortunately, that's just not how things go. And I understand that developers also do still have a responsibility at the end of the day to consider the broad spectrum of hardware capabilities that are out there. You still have people on 1080s, you still have people on 2060s. The 2060 is still a good card, it's just lacking in VRAM. That's the one big hamper that it's had. Yeah, it might get a little warm, that's depending on which manufacturer you go through, but it's still a good card at the end of the day. It will still run games at 1080p, 60 FPS, plenty fine. You can probably get up to 90, 120 FPS depending on what game you're playing, and depending on, more importantly, and this is the big stressor, what settings you use. Because all of the big noise around, oh, this game is running at 20 FPS on the 5090, blah, 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 blah. You know that it has every single setting cranked all the way up to do that. And that's what they're trying to show, is that this thing will do this thing better, quote unquote. And NVIDIA, of course, wants you to buy a new GPU anytime they release a new one. And they want you to buy multiple. That's not something you have to do, ever, in all reality. The thing to look for, though, is, honestly, what is the console doing? What is the hardware that is in the console that is making this thing last forever? What is the thing that Sony or Microsoft wanted the developers to work with? And sorry, buddy, but it's ray tracing, and it's SSDs. It's those two big technologies that those consoles had to come out, right? The only thing that was hampering the Xbox One X was the hard drive. It's still a good console, minus the hard drive. You bump that up to an SSD that's faster than 6 gigabits per second, like you're going to have something that, could actually run relatively well still nowadays. Like if you had a developer that was developing solely for that, the Xbox One X, not even the series consoles, the older one, the Xbox One, the 4K machine, It wasn't really 4K. If you have a developer that is targeting exactly that hardware, they will be able to optimize for that hardware. Simple as that. Some developers want to put as much tech as possible in their game so that in the future, when you have a card 8 years from now, you can load up their game and it will have technology that was built thinking about this card that is coming out in the future. Not necessarily the hardware that we have today, but something in the future. And that's how it always goes. You'll see these games that can barely run for the first couple of years of their life. And it's because, oh, by the way, they were using path tracing for their lighting this whole time. That's why it ran like shit. I think the biggest takeaway, though, is that you can find used cards nowadays for super duper cheap. You can find a used 30 series for $300. 20 series, I bet you could find one for under $2. So if it's a huge upgrade to upgrade your 10 series to a 30 or 40 series, I understand that you want to find the value in spending money. But if you go with a 6800 XT, you can find that for $400. And that's a meaningful upgrade from the 1080 Ti. Yes, it's Team Red. Yes, it's something a little bit different, but it will have more than enough VRAM for the future. It's a good enough core to run games at a high frame rate and high resolutions. And if we look at the id Tech engine, the one that Indiana Jones and Doom the Dark Ages are going to be running on, or are running on currently, the id Tech engine has always been magic. It has always been something that will run what you want it to run, and run it on whatever you want it to run on, because it's scalable. It scales down and it scales up. Doom 2018 used to be Doom 2016 used to be a very hard game to run for hardware that was old already. Current hardware could run it perfectly fine, but if you had something 6-7 years old at the time, had something from 2014, you had a RX 580 that was kind of trying to burn your house down all the time, it might not be something that would run that well. Turns out, as soon as you start the game up, runs fine. Runs at whatever resolution you have it set at 60 FPS. Now, depending on your card, it might not have all the bells and whistles. It might not have the flashy screen space reflections. It might not have the DLSS super resolution. It may not be able to run at 4K because of the card that you're running on. Like, all of these things are little microcosms that are of the PC. You run that game on an Xbox or a PlayStation, and it runs fine. Same thing with Doom Eternal, and the same thing is going to be with Doom the Dark Ages, because the developers are targeting that hardware. Simple as that. And they're targeting it for a good reason, because the adoption rate has been so high. And you gotta remember that so many people built computers during 2020 that a lot of them have ray tracing capable cards. A lot of them got into gaming during that time. A lot of people bought PlayStations. A lot of people bought Xboxes. And it's to the point where the market has seen a shift where even mid-range GPUs have full ray tracing support. They have plenty of cores to do it, and it's been there for years. A lot of these people don't really understand that they have to go and play with settings, and that's part of the fun, quote unquote, is playing around and figuring out what will make your hardware run the best on this specific game, and it goes through and blah blah blah. A lot of people don't care about that. They press the one button that says optimize, and that's it. They play the game. And if the game runs good, they don't complain. If it doesn't, they start complaining. If you are running something that doesn't have a lot of cores, and especially not a lot of ray tracing cores, that can put a significant load on your GPU, especially if you are loading a lot of rays that's stored in the VRAM. The VRAM is not plentiful. It is not something that is just abundant. Even if you have a 5090, you still only have 36 gigs of VRAM, 32 gigs of VRAM. Like, it is not a whole terrible amount. It is a lot, but it is not infinite. Some games will implement ray tracing and you won't even notice it. It'll be something that is so subtle, it's just the little reflections, or it's just the water caustics, or it's just this or that or that or that. Nothing super major, it's just enough to catch a glint or show some eye candy. Sometimes that implementation will tank your performance down to nothing, or you won't even notice it. There is no in between. There is no like that kind of ray tracing will only take a little bit of your hardware requirements. It won't, oh, it's not going to do that much, versus, oh, by the way, they're simulating all of the lighting in this scene for that one little puddle so that it can accurately reflect everything around it. As gamers and developers and these hardware manufacturers get better and this technology gets longer in the tooth, we're going to see significant improvements. For example, if we look at monitors and the technology there, we went from CRT, which was a pretty decent picture in all reality. It was a very good picture, high frame rate. You could get very high frame rates out of a CRT monitor. And then we switched to plasma and VA and IPS and these different technologies that some looked better, some ran better. And then you had a new technology come in from first in TVs, and we saw, oh wow, this is cool. And then it came down to gaming monitors, and then you saw high frame rate OLED monitors. Something that has beaten out most IPS panels, almost every VA panel in terms of frame rate. IPS panels, we're talking about the color reproduction and the blacks and things like that. You're going to have varying degrees of good, better, best when it comes to displays in general. And more often than not, you're going to find OLEDs will sit up top, whether it be a QD OLED or it be regular OLED. There's a couple other newer technologies that are coming out that are kind of going to be maybe cheaper, but they're not being manufactured as quickly or as broadly, or as... You get the point. At the end of the day, you don't need everything turned on all the time. You may want to, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Like for example, with the new 50 series cards. Most of the time, it does not make sense for you to turn on multi-frame generation because you are not getting better latency, you're just getting a higher frame rate because your base frame rate is still 60 FPS. So you're playing a 60 FPS game, your input latency is 60 FPS, but your monitor is showing 240 frames per second. It can feel a little jarring. It can look good to, a couple people, oh, higher number go higher, so therefore I feel better, right? But if you're not running at a high enough base frame rate, it can actually obliterate your performance. It will make it feel sluggish and slow and unresponsive. And those things are because we're not turning everything on or off, right? We're turning everything on and we're trying to get the most performance out of it. Sometimes that's just not the case. Sometimes you need to play the balancing game. You need to see the visual fidelity versus performance balance, and sometimes it just makes sense to turn down the settings a little bit because today's games still look good at medium. They still look good at low. So I think at the end of the day, it is very much time for us to allow developers to use the technologies that have been sitting, waiting for them. Because if you think about it, the PlayStation has had ray tracing for a while because it's built in. It's just been sitting there. Not many games have been able to fully utilize it. So if you have a game that comes along and requires it, it causes the entire community, the entire developer landscape is going to change because of it, because they're going to see that, oh, hey, they're getting more accurate material detections when somebody's shooting something. So therefore, they're tracing the bullet, using rays to trace the bullet to see what hits, instead of using ray tracing to just do lighting. There could be a plethora of things that these cores could be dedicated to in the render pipeline. Throughout the whole logic of the game, you could actually be using these cores and taking advantage of the hardware that is sitting there just not doing anything if you don't let these developers do something with it.